Hey, welcome to Solidarity Talks, and we're going to start with Donny Riki.
Stand up. Sorry, I need to stand up to acknowledge, respect our ancestors. Te mea tuatahi, kanui te mihi aroha kia tātou atua, ko rangi nui rau ko papatu anuku, tēnā korua. Tēnei te mihi kia tātou atua me tupuna hoki no ngā hau e whā. Mihi atu ki te iwi mana whenua o tēnei rohe, ko mua upoko me Ngāti Raukawa hoki. Kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Whakatake te hau ki te uru, whakatake te hau ki te tunga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana tākura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, te hei Māori ora. So I begin by acknowledging and sending our greetings to our Sky Father and our Earth Mother, to the land, to the waters, to the sacred mountains, and the whenua tapu, the sacred land that I'm standing on, of the Mua Upoko and Ngāti Raukawa people. I acknowledge my ancestors as well as your ancestors, Vic, and yours too, Riel, who have brought us together on this beautiful morning here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to share in these in this conversation we're about to have, and I certainly acknowledge and thank you for the time and hosting this for us too, Vic. So mihi atu kia koe, kia korua, kia ora. Thank you. Yeah. Back to you.
Riel?
Yawa goa, great thanks. I'd like to take a moment to also acknowledge the territories that this good work will be conducted on today. I'd like to give acknowledgement, profound and deep respect and acknowledgement and honoring to the homelands, the unceded and occupied homelands of our Coast Salish hosts, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the profound impacts of colonization on these territories and the attempts to disrupt the sacred roles and responsibilities of the peoples of the host nations, which have been shared with me, are deeply felt, and that deep commitment remains. I want to honor that dedication and the strength and the wisdom of those roles. I also want to take a moment to honor the fact that all of Great Turtle Island is unceded and occupied territory, Indigenous territory, and to honor all of our peoples, all of our cultures, all of our nations in our great homelands, Great Turtle Island. Yes, the strength and the courage and the honor and the integrity of our peoples to maintain our sacred roles and responsibilities, I'd like to give acknowledgement for, as well as all that has been provided to us by Great Spirit of creation in our homelands. Yawa goa, Donny, for calling in our sacred ancestors and relatives, and I honor your people and your territories as well. It's a deep, I'm very honored to be here with the both of you today. Yawa goa, skin and goa gay, I wish you the great peace.
Thanks so much for that. I really appreciate that. I think maybe we should say a little bit about who we are first. So I'm Vikki Reynolds. I'm a therapist and a direct action activist. I guess I'm an adjunct prof and do a lot of supervision and teaching. My people are from England, Ireland, and Newfoundland. I'm from a clan, a very tight Irish Catholic clan, and I'm a straight woman with cisgender privilege. I have a PhD, so I've got way too much academic privilege. I'm from working class people. Those are the politics that really matter to me. And everything that I always do is so inherently collaborative from my own culture, from my people, from the teachings of my family, my extended clan, the ways that our elders guarded our dignity, our spirituality, and our culture and let us know who we were. As a white settler, that's a huge gift because so many white settlers here only identify as Canadian. Well, I know that I'm on Indigenous territory, the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh people. I want to, and I just acknowledge all of the survivors of torture, survivors of violence that I've learned all my work on the back of. That's where everything that I come from, and really honored to be with the two of you. So maybe Donny, just locate yourself in the work. That'd be great.
Kia ora. Yeah, kia ora. Thank you, Vic and Riel. Yeah, ko ai hau, anei taku pipiha, I te taho tōku matua no te taitukirau ia, ko Ngāpuhi te iwi, ko Ngātuki mata whaoroa te waka, ko whiria te maunga, I te taho tōku mama no Kaiawa ia, ko Tainui te waka, ko Ngāti Paoa te iwi, ko Donny Riki taku ingoa I whakatipu ana a hau kei Tokoroa, engari ko taitoko e noho ana nai nei. Tēnā koutou katoa. So my people, my dad's people are Ngāpuhi, which is the very top of the North Island, from this beautiful little village called Opunoni, which is right on the coast. And my mum is from, she's Ngāti Paoa, which is on the sort of just in the Firth of Thames there, just south of Auckland. Yeah, so she comes from the Tainui waka. So my name is Donny Riki. I was born and raised in Tokoroa, which is right in the centre of the North Island in Aotearoa here. And I'm currently living in Levin, which is just a little north of Wellington. So I identify as a cisgendered straight woman with white partner privilege. My partner is a GP, so I have a lot of privilege from through that relationship. And together we have 5 tamariki, five children, 4 adults. One is 16, so she's our youngest one. We've got 2 grandbabies and a big puppy who's flopping around here somewhere in the background. Yeah, kia ora. So that's pretty much me. I've been a psychotherapist for 20 plus years, and so I've worked in the I started working in the psych ward, which was really kind of jumping into the deep end, and was horrified at the way that Māori people were being treated, which really mobilized my my relentless sort of passion to change how Māori people were being treated within the health system, and particularly in mental health. So yeah, that's pretty much me from now. Kia ora.
Sego, my name is Riel Dupuis-Rossi. I am Kanien'kehá and Algonquin on my father's side, and I'm Italian on my mother's side. I grew up in my traditional territories, but off reserve, in place most known now as Hamilton, Ontario, and Montreal, Quebec. And I've been living in the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples since 2011, where I've been practicing in an Indigenous specific counseling program called the Aboriginal Wellness Program. There I've been providing culturally centered decolonizing psychotherapy to all Indigenous adults, individuals, families, couples, and groups for the last decade, and feel very honored to have had that sacred role and responsibility. I can relate to what you're saying, Donny, in terms of witnessing the what I've come to understand as genocidal treatment of our peoples within healthcare institutions, and have also felt very moved to bring that to light and make that more visible. It often is relegated to sort of a unseen realm where these kind of horrors happen. So a lot of my work in the last year has been about shedding some light on that as well, having heard from it in many different forms from people with whom I work over the last decade. It's just it's one of the ways that the relentless war on our people takes shape and takes form. So thank you for acknowledging that too. And yeah, just very honored to be in the circle with you both today. All my relations.
Thanks so much for that. So these solidarity talks, I'm just trying to create some space for voices that need to get heard and centered more. And I just thought of the two of you together, even though you hadn't met. In my mind, you were so in alliance and in solidarity with each other ethically, because you're both people who have challenged me, questioned me, moved me forward, kind of kicked me in the ass, led me at times, dragged me at times to accountability. And but to also into making more space. And I just thought it would be lovely to see what might be emergent in a dialogue with the two of you together. And so I just think one of the things that is, when I think of both of you, when I think of you, Donny Riki, and you, Riel, I think about centering Indigenous knowledge and how rare that is in therapy, in psychology, in any of the helping professions. And I'm wondering if you want to say something about how is it that you are resisting this white supremacist dominance within the stuff that gets called therapy, right? Within the capitalist patriarchal project that's going on. And how do you center Indigenous knowledge in therapy? What are some of the things that you're doing? What are some of your sites of resistance? What are some of the struggles? Any run at that question, Donny?
Yeah. I'm thinking, I could kind of, I just need to make sure that I focus and don't get too carried away. It's kind of, there are so many. I think one of the most important things in Māori culture or in our Indigenous knowing is knowing our whakapapa, and that's knowing our tribal links back to our land. And what that kind of means, and the authority or how that legitimizes our position as Māori people. So to even kind of learn our pepeha, to recite our pepeha, which is kind of reciting our pepeha like I did at the beginning, can actually be seen as quite a political protest to colonial practice. So certainly in the realm of psychotherapy. The container of safety is Māori culture, is Māori tikanga. It's our culture, it's our ritual, it's our way of understanding the world. And then Western psychotherapy is kind of poured into that container. It's not the other way around. And that's what I've kind of seen here a lot of having Western psychotherapies, and they want to somehow kind of like add in these bits of Māori culture to be perceived as being a bicultural program or a bicultural ethical way of being, but it's actually not. So a lot of decol is pretty much front and center of my practice and working with Māori people. That's kind of like a really it's incredibly important to work on that and to build that up, and everything else kind of comes naturally around that. But we need to really kind of pay attention and focus on those tribal connections to land, to people, to the earth, to the sky, which kind of shapes our world. Yeah, it's all of our creation stories, which we call pūrākau, which are our codified stories that are in the stars, that are in the in the sea, and the way that we understand the natural world are becoming much more documented and researched and known. But there's a space for all of these pūrākau with our creation stories actually within the context of therapy. So that's kind of my go-to, and it's kind of like something that I think I intrinsically or inherently know, although there hasn't really been a legitimate space for that within Western practice. So So it's kind of being able to find a way to navigate the space and how to use that, when it's kind of like I guess kind of when it's more sort of like appropriate to bring in the Western stuff. It's like the Māori stuff comes first and then the Western stuff comes second. So that's just a bit of a just the way I think Māori or Indigenous practices is centered. Yeah. What's your whakaaro? What are your thoughts on that, Riel?
Donny, thank you for putting that so beautifully. I would just sort of build off what you're saying. What I have found in terms of your question, Vicki, is when in my practice, meeting with people, Indigenous people for the first time, there's often a high level of distress. People are in crisis or different states of distress. And I have found time and time again that naming colonial oppression and naming 500 years of attempted and ongoing genocide, very effective in terms of putting words to those invisibilized, genocidal forces, like naming the war on our people, and that it's been happening for 500 years and it's still happening now. And the cause of the distress that people are feeling is rooted in colonial oppression and genocidal war. And then, just focusing on expanding our sense of ourselves as Onkwehonwe in our own homelands, as Indigenous people in our own homelands, to that place where time began, and that we have been living in our own homelands with gratitude, for lack of for an English word, with great spirit of creation, who has provided us with every single thing that we need to thrive in our territories, and to come back to that place of profound love and relationality with all of our relations, and to just acknowledge the depth of the connection and the bond and the relationship that's been there since time immemorial, as you're saying, Donny, to land and to the four-leggeds, to the ones that swim and the ones that crawl and the ones that fly, and great spirit of creation, to our grandmothers and grandfathers, to the trees, to the rocks, to the mountains, to the waterways, and to recall and center how that relationality, like that we are in relation with all of our relations, and this is who we are in our own homeland since time immemorial, and the distress that we feel is a product of ongoing and attempted genocidal warfare.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'm just thinking as I'm listening to you, Riel, what are some of the structures of, quote, psychotherapy that you need to resist in order to be able to center Indigenous knowledge and ways of being?
Donny, are you okay if it's for me, what comes to me is time, like just at the outset, to sort of reclaim a sense of timelessness that I feel has cultural congruence with our cultures being based in time immemorial, since the point where time began, our cultures began, and to try to call on the spirit of that timelessness, if I can put it that way, where things, the colonial capitalist machine and its grindings and its attack and its oppression can stop, and where we can be in an Indigenous space, in an Indigenous time, and together. I mean, I work with people, Donny, who come from different nations and different cultures than my own. So we're working, in that shared spirit of Great Turtle Island being our homelands, and a respect for that diversity that, has existed on Great Turtle Island since the beginning of time. So calling in the spirit of that as well, right? Our ability to be in relationship, in loving, respectful, honoring relationship with all of our relations, including ourselves as Indigenous people from different nations and different parts of Great Turtle Island.
Wow. Thanks for that. I'm just thinking, what are some of the structures that you're resisting, Donny, in your work or in your ways of being, paid and unpaid, in terms of trying to center Maori knowledges in a realm that's called psychotherapy, that's so white supremacist and Eurocentric?
Yeah, absolutely. I can really resonate with what you're saying, Riel, about, about time as being sort of like, a very effective colonial construct, and that we have to find ways to, to kind of meet this, we've got time limits on things, and we have to kind of meet this, we kind of like keep putting things into a box, or where, we have to kind of keep putting things in a box. So, I mean, time is a really important sort of, I guess, kind of an important tool to be able to just kind of like take time. I mean, even time in the realm of psychotherapy is kind of like dictated. It's actually prescribed. You see a person or a client for 1 hour a week, and for many Māori people that just doesn't work. It's like really, and anything more or less than that is perhaps seen as unprofessional or breaking boundaries and things. But time, space is another thing. That it's always really important to kind of to use space and to be in a space that feels congruent with what needs to happen, like using our rituals around water, at a stream or a lake, or at the river, even in the ngahere in the forest, to reconnect with the trees, to feel Papatunuku, our earth mother beneath our feet. Yet we're kind of, we're sort of told this prescribed therapy needs to, occur within the safe parameters of an office, and anything outside of the therapeutic office is seen as potentially dangerous. And then the other thing is relationships, and you've spoken a lot about relationships, Riel, and so there's a real sort of parallel there in terms of our, in terms of how we, I guess, kind of define our well-being. It's and through relationships with others, with our people, with our culture, with the natural world, with the weather, with weather patterns, and having a kind of like a resonance or an attunement to the environment is obviously really, really important. And I think that we as Indigenous people, we do that pretty well. Yeah.
When I hear you speak, I'm thinking about Flora Tahaka. I went to Aotearoa, New Zealand 20 years ago to study with the Just Therapy people, because I was running the Center for Survivors of Torture, and I was so worried about white supremacy. We weren't even using language like that then, and colonization, and what was I replicating with people. And I remember Flora Tahaka took me under her wing. I did an intensive with her. She was leading the Maori section of the Just Therapy people in Wellington. And we did a lot of like living work. So she was with a Maori family and brought me right in to meet with the families, and I was honored because there was a lot of students, and she brought me in. And then I just remember the first family that came in, she said, "Oh, should we start with a prayer?" And I was like, no, we should not start with a prayer. I just finished my master's. I was like, absolutely not. Like, and I'm Irish Catholic. I'm like, my religion has been so horrible. It's like, no, don't out me as a Catholic, for God's sake. And everybody stood up and they held hands and they said a prayer. And then she goes, and now we need to talk about whakapapa, right? And she said, like, how are you and I connected? And I was like, no, you can't do therapy with people you're connected to. Like, I was just like, I kept waiting for the professors who had taught me in my master's to get the big net and scoop me out and say, Reynolds, we were worried about you. Now look at you. You're doing religion and you're doing bad boundaries, And of course, what Flora Tahaka I just looked like I was in such pain. And she looked at me and she sent me this message that said, get over yourself, stand up, get in a sacred space, pray with these people, and tell them how you're related to them. Show up, white girl. And it was like one of the most awesome teachings that just rocked my world and made so much space for me to bring the sacred, the sacred and connection. And those are the things, psychology, in terms of neutrality and objectivity, you're not supposed to bring any of that stuff. And it's just such a colonizing practice. Anyway, so just as you were speaking, Donny, I was remembering, I think Flora Tahaka is the one that just stood up and took on psychotherapy and these tropes of, things that just invisibilize Indigenous ways of being and centered it in such a way that it was so uncomfortable that you knew something important was happening. Travis Heath always says that if you're asking questions or saying something and everybody is really uncomfortable, it must be doing some important work. He's a Black therapist from Colorado. I'm just wondering about any thoughts you have about that stuff. But I was brand new to the work and I thought, oh God, I've been outed. I'm a race traitor. I'm not being a good white girl. I know how to be white. I know how to be white. I should be hiding here.
That's great. That's great. It's a great story, and it's something I think that resonates, and with lots of Pākehā people that I've worked with, or that I've kind of met, or where there's trainings or gatherings or something, that it's a very difficult process for them to enter into. They feel like it's over disclosing. I'm over disclosing myself.
Donny, you got to tell everybody what Pākehā means.
Oh, sorry. A Pākehā is the white settlers, the white Europeans that came and colonized. They're the colonizers of Aotearoa. Yeah. So we've always call them Pākehā. Yeah. Mm. So, and it's a term of respect, actually, too. It's not sort of to takahi on them, to put them down, but it's kind of just acknowledging them as the white colonizers. Mm.
Right. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just didn't want to leave people behind. So what you're saying is there's just that's just something. What do you think makes it so hard for Pākehā people to access spirituality and connection?
Well, I think having talked to lots of people, lots of Pākehā about it, a lot of them actually don't know, that don't really know where they came from, because their ancestors fled. They fled what was happening overseas, and then they came here and colonized us. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there's a lot of shame and guilt around colonization, and the more knowing there is about genocide, ethnocide, and ecocide, they will often get into a space of whakamā, which is like a space of shame and collapsed sort of shame. It's like, oh my God, it's like it kind of, what do I do? And then there are others that just completely deny it. Yeah. It's like, well, we were invited here and Māori needed to be colonized, sort of thing. So it's almost like this very sort of grandiose attitude about it, perspective. Yeah, it was progression. Yeah.
Riel, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I guess just going back a few steps, and then I'll come, if that's okay. Just the question that you asked us at the beginning was really important. I just wanted to also say that I think that every step of the therapeutic process that we sort of are trained into, we have to resist as onkwe honwe, right? From just the initial assessments and the pressures to diagnose and to see people, our people in a certain way, really through that lens of pathologizing, right? And Vicki, in some of the talks that we've done, I appreciate that we put it like locating the problem within the person and completely, disappearing the political context and the reality of people's lives, right? That oppression. So I think that I just wanted to say that I believe that occurs at every single step of the therapy, to be decolonizing and to recenter our cultural knowing and Indigenous ways is something that's, occurring assessment, diagnosis, and treatment. Even the words termination, right? We're taught, oh, you terminate somebody, and I can't think of a more horrible way to sort of put it. So just to elaborate a little bit, but then to catch up with you both in the conversation, that I just rely on the elders' teachings that I've been given about how when you leave the bones of your ancestors and the territories that you're from, you become sort of lost in another people's land, right? So I feel strongly what I've observed, that capitalism and colonialism and the privileges that come with that sort of obscure a more spiritual and existential soulful weakness and destitution, right? So I you know, in Mohawk terms, like I think there's just a real contrast in terms of what wealth means to us as Indigenous people. We've always been very wealthy in our own homelands, you know, provided for by the waters and the forests and the sky and, you know, the moon and the stars and the sun, like we're provided for by great spirit of creation, and our philosophies and our languages and our ways of relating to one another and our ceremonies reflect that richness, for, you know, to put it in an English word, that wealth. But I have, in listening to the elders speak about the spiritual implications of being a settler, and then seeing the ways that, you know, very genocidal agendas get pushed through, and the exchange is sort of these very material and shallow sort of privileges that, like I say, ultimately I believe hide a spiritual ill, state of dis-ease and imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm thinking also about like some of what both of you have taught me about like disrupting the white supremacy and the certainty and the arrogance of psychotherapy by just like a critical engagement with language around like things like attachment disruption. And why this stands out for me the most is I started this work by being a youth worker, and there's great collective accountability. Shame, I don't think, is so useful. What I'm trying to move to is collective accountability. But I've worked with Indigenous youth who have been in, like, by the time they're 16, 20 different foster homes or group homes or something. And then that youth is given a diagnosis of attachment disorder. And I'm like, who has the attachment disorders as collectively, as a society, apprehending, you know, we have more, we have more Aboriginal youth apprehended and in the quote care of the government now than during residential schools or during the stolen generations, right? And then to be able to, you know, moving that child, like moving that person around so that they can't create any connections, but spiritually and culturally, they're not the right places to be connected anyway. And then being able to pathologize that youth, that, oh, okay, they've got attachment disorder. And, you know, some of the criteria for that is an inability to trust or make relationships. So it's like, I just always think about how weaponized white supremacy is in psychotherapy, that when white workers can't work with an Indigenous youth, when we don't build a bridge of trust and decency and being useful at all, we can always accuse this youth of having this attachment disruption that we have created by disrupting them. And I'm thinking, just about, just some of the ways you've taken that apart, Donny. And also you, Riel, speaking of that ethic of connection and relationality, that's the word that's kind of floating above us.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of layers to that conversation, that are lots of points of connection that I want to respond to, and I'm just kind of thinking about best how I can kind of respond to that. But yeah, I do talk quite a lot about you know, attachment and attachment theory from a Western perspective, and do this sort of like comparative analysis from a Māori worldview, and I'm sure there would be parallels with other Indigenous cultures as well, that, you know, that the attachment with the land. And I feel really moved and inspired when I see our kaitiaki or our guardians, you know, at Maunga Kea in Hawaii, and Standing Rock, and Ihu Matao in Auckland here, all kind of like upholding the rights for the land to not be taken over and fracked and carved up and things. So and I talk about attachment as beyond Western theories or Western ideas of a mother-baby dyadic relationship, but that it's kind of like there's multiple relationships with family and extended family, but the primordial attachment with our earth mother and with our, with our land. And I grew up sort of believing that our guardian spirits were housed in these special mountains, and so our mountains became really sacred. And so when we passed over to the spirit world, well then, the guardian spirits kind of like come out and they take us to rejoin our ancestors, and Te Kāinga Tūturu, where we rejoin our ancestors, and so our mountains are incredibly sacred, and to forcing Māori people off of that land because it's been stolen, resold and carved up and chopped up and all the rest of it is a profound spiritual assault, profound, and and it's still happening today. It's still happening, and it's incredibly painful. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So certainly from a Māori worldview, going back to the land and going back to how we kind of identify when we take space and say, this is who I am, and these are my ancestors, and this is my spiritual mountain, my sacred mountain, and my spiritual waters and things, is actually making a very public declaration of, that I am tangata whenua, I am of the land, I am the land is me, and I am the land, and which goes against, of course, colonial ways of being. So that's kind of a really useful part of decolonization, and actually kind of learning about pepeha, learning about how we whakapapa back to the land, how we can go back through our ancestral footprints and see how we can make those connections back to the land as not only a healing experience, but it's decolonizing all of these Western discourses of mental health. But it's a significant determinant of good spiritual health is knowing your whakapapa, knowing where you come from, and standing on the land.
I can really feel, like, even across Zoom and across the ocean, I feel your heartbreak on that, Donny.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about land defenders here in British Columbia on traditional territories, and the state violence using police, the RCMP, who were invented to clear the land of Indigenous people, police forces on every level, and the state violence against land defenders here. And then thinking about Eve Tuck, Indigenous scholar, who talks about, if you're going to use language like you're decolonizing, you are talking about land back. This is about land return and Indigenous governance. And I just think, as a white settler person, so much of the discourse, thanks to a bunch of Indigenous activism like Idle No More and other things, you have settler people thinking about decolonization, but it doesn't go, if it's not land back, if it's not about the return of land and Indigenous governments, it's not decolonizing, it's something else, right? You're using it as a metaphor, as Eve Tuck would say. So I really felt that in my bones as you were talking, Donny.
Yeah, kia ora, thank you. Yeah. And I'm just I'm just sitting with, I'm not far away from Mount Taranaki, where Parihaka, the takeover in Parihaka, where that was kind of staged, and or not staged, that's kind of like the colonial troops went in on their horses. There was about 1,600 troops, and they went into the Māori village, and the Māori people didn't want war, and the woman cooked meals for the troops, the children sang to them, and yet they were still treated really, really badly and forced off the land. And so I think it became known as the passive resistance movement, and Gandhi actually followed what happened in Parihaka back then, but it was a very sort of poignant time in history, in our history. And that still it's still very present today.
Mhm.
I mean, that was well over 100 years, well over 100 years ago, but it's still very present, you know. And their people, I have the privilege of sitting with some of their people sometimes. Some of their families come and we sit and we share a space and we drink cups of tea and we, you know, talk about healing and talk about, you know, recovery and resistance and how they've resisted colonial violence and still continue to resist colonial violence. And
Yeah.
yeah, that just made me think of that. So yeah, thanks for that reflection.
Thank you. And thanks for bringing your heart, your tender heart. Riel, I'm just wondering what you're thinking, or if you have a reflection or response.
I just want to thank you for bringing the water in our teachings. The tears are sacred water, Donny. And I think I was, you know, talking to a friend before, you know, sharing my excitement about sitting with you both. And I was saying, oh, geez, what the heck am I going to say about attachment disruption? Because ultimately, I only ever ended up using that language to speak to how much it hurts in your heart. As an Indigenous person, it's just extremely painful. So to witness the pain of Maori warrior and healer such as yourself is very validating, Donny. And I was also just saying, you know, we have to get into so much complicated explanations to non-Indigenous people, when for Indigenous people, I think we just understand heart to heart the pain, the pain of being forcibly removed and disconnected from our territories, where, you know, that love is just so profound and it's been handed down to us from one generation to the next since the beginning of time. So you can imagine how deep those waters of love run, and to have, you know, such profound and violent disruption of that relationship is just so deeply felt on a daily basis for us as Indigenous people. And then, you know, adding on to that with the disconnection of, you know, the forced disconnection, you know, I'll speak for myself, of language and many of our teachings and our stories, our original instructions, but then, you know, from our relatives, right? Our communities, our grandparents, and I speak about it in terms of, you know, even if for me, I for instance, like I knew my grandfather. He was a major part of my life, but what the residential school did to him, I have come to understood, like, just like our territories have been stolen and occupied, so too are our relatives stolen and occupied. So in the case of my grandfather, for example, a residential school survivor, he was there, but very much occupied by that residential school violence, right? And we then experience that in our families as well, right? So the attachment disruption of that, and speaking about, okay, transgenerationally, like our relatives experience that directly from the colonizer, and there's a certain clarity about that. But when you start to experience what the colonizer has done through the hands of your family, then that, I feel strongly, is the genocidal aspect of it, that it becomes confused for us, that we start to associate our families with genocidal and colonial violence, and our communities with genocidal and colonial violence, with that obscuring and that hijacking of our peoples, take us from our land and then hijack our hearts, our minds, our spirits with this colonial violence, and then you bring it back. So there's a complexity to the pain and a simplicity to the pain at the same simultaneously. And I believe for us as Indigenous people, we just have a understanding of that amongst ourselves, right? Intuitively, inherently, in a felt sense, like a lived experience of that. but it's very hard to convey the depth and the profundity of it in these terms we're given from a Western perspective that's inherently disconnected from land and intimate love and relationship, right? So for me, that's what motivated me to sort of call on this notion of attachment disruption, and then sort of subvert it and expand it and redefine it for our own purposes as Indigenous people in an attempt to have that pain and the impact of colonization, the intimate impacts of colonization become visible. All my relations.
Kia ora, thank you, Riel. You've put that, you've articulated that so beautifully, and I really appreciate the depth of description that you've explained that, like across time, and through worlds. You've put that so beautifully. Thank you so much.
I was looking, I should have planned better. I was looking for a writing from you, Riel, on there's a quote from you that I really love in an article that we co-authored around trauma work and Indigenous perspectives. And you said, you laid out something really lovely in terms of the politicization of trauma and how we use trauma in psychology, of course. There's no language anymore of violence, colonization, oppression. It's trauma. And, that critique that I often talk about, like, you can get trauma from a car accident. This is very different. There's something so benign. There's no oppressor. There's no context of genocide that's required. So I'm thinking about if you could say a bit more about the ethical, it's essential in order to be ethical and work with Indigenous people to be able to put trauma within a political context and the meaningfulness of that. Where we're always critiqued as being way too political, we're supposed to be more neutral. But to be neutral about this is to side with colonization and locate trauma as if people are broken somehow in their brains. And I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about the importance of politicizing trauma and locating it within the colonial context and how you do that.
Donny, did you want to go first, or would you?
You could probably go first, Riel, because you're so articulate in this. And
I got you. I mean, I feel very moved and inspired to hear you, Donny. Very moved. I think that Vicki, at the time that we were writing, we were speaking about it in terms of the connective power of politicizing trauma. And what I found in sitting with Indigenous peoples, who, again, what I was observing in, my caseload was people were coming to me and talking about, oh, I have borderline personality disorder, or I have OCD, or I have, just these terms that just felt so objectifying and so pathologizing. And yet the only thing that many of our people were being given by mental health systems to understand their experiences, right? And so holding on. And in my teachings that I've been, given, was that there's power in naming, that naming ceremony, right? We have our traditional naming ceremonies, and it actually defines your sense of yourself and how your community relates to you and your roles and your responsibility within that community. So I started thinking about it in terms of what is the spiritual, cultural, impact on our people of being told you have OCD, or you have, borderline personality, or even dissociative personality disorders, right? So this is where, for me, I started, in my own understanding, okay, well, we know that these things come from residential school. We know this comes from the reservation system. We know this comes, what I was seeing is people were being told that they were in a psychotic episode, but they were actually like reliving something that their grandmother had gone through. And this was very real. If you actually sat and spoke with people about what they were experiencing, it came down to a real lived experience of colonial violence, right? And then, you know, that being sort of understood in terms of shock trauma, complex trauma, transgenerational trauma, all these different forms of trauma. But to frame that in genocide, like, and to frame that in colonization, started to externalize those burdens and that of that pathologizing sort of process, and give sort of, now we can start to breathe, right? Now there's a little bit of space to start locating and identifying our strengths as Indigenous people, right? Identifying our own reference points about what our own existence and our own territories meant, right? So people could, you know, Indigenous people could start thinking about their families, their territories, their inheritances, and reclaiming those cultural, transgenerational, territorial inheritances, and make that the point of reference, center in that, right? And the rest in terms of the diagnosis and just the obscuring of political genocidal violence, you know, that could become externalized, so to speak. And then where we center ourselves as Onkwehonwe is in our own ways, you know, and then we can sit there as two Indigenous people in a room and locate our strengths and our resistance, as you both would have said, right? And our existences in our own homeland since time immemorial, right? That becomes visible when we start to politicize trauma. Our existences in our own homelands, which are often disappeared with a genocidal agenda, become visible again. Yeah.
Yeah, kia ora, Riel. I really picked up on your energy rising as you were talking about resistance.
Thank you. Yes, there's something to it. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely and totally agree with, you know, with what you're saying about how we you know, points of reference, and how we kind of identify and maintain those connections, and we kind of reclaim, you know, that really kind of rich sort of wisdom and philosophy that's you know, that we've inherited from our ancestors. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to pick up the thread of you know, like naming, like outing, I guess, as Alan Wade would say, outing the perp, or out and because trauma obscures who did what to whom, you know, and so using accurate language to say that, you know, we're not suffering from trauma, we're suffering from violence, from colonial violence, so that we can kind of out the perp. So we're really clear around who's doing what to whom, and we're not obscuring that by the language that we use. So that's really pertinent to sort of like exposing and I guess kind of like contextualizing people's experience, and the Indigenous experience in a colonial world. What I was just kind of thinking before, what you were kind of saying about, you know, how we kind of respond and we resist violence, and how we from a mental health framework, we've been given these diagnoses of, you know, of depression or whatever, that in terms of a spiritual illness, we have. I guess I talk quite a bit about when I have to, because I have to do assessments, and the assessments, rather than using, you know, the DSM with, you know, diagnostic criteria, I use our own language, and I talk about mana, about which is dignity, and how our dignity has been assaulted and attacked through multiple generations and continues to kind of do so. And so I talk about mana tangata, mana whenua, and mana atua. And so mana tangata is our connections with you know, with other people, and how we are in relation with them, and how we're in relationship with ourselves, and how women become sort of like spiritually disconnected from their body, from their whare tangata, which is, you know, we're known as whare tangata, which means the person we house mankind, like the building that brings new life into the world. And so there's a real sacredness about that, about our whare tangata. And so there's a significant spiritual disruption when a woman has been violated, and it affects not only all of the generations forward, but actually back as well. It's a transgression on all of our on our kuia, on our female elders that go back in our whakapapa, in our line of genealogy. So that's an absolute violation across multiple sort of generations when that kind of happens for a woman. So I talk a lot about mana tangata, and what that kind of means for women and how we need to heal. I also talk about mana whenua, which is the spiritual and physical attachment or detachment, that rupture from land and identity to our tribes people, being severed in connection from our sacred mountains and our waterways, and you know, the ecocidal harm that's happening for our people. And mana atua is talking about the loss of I guess, you know, like the ruptures or the violations between our culture, our spiritual beliefs, our own sort of Indigenous philosophies, our own sort of creation stories, and our way of being. So it's kind of like it's a circular sort of process rather than a hierarchical one, as they would have in it's not a multi-axial hierarchical one like clinical models, but it's a very sort of, you know, inclusive sort of circular process that happens around people. And colonization just cuts across the whole thing, and, you know, through the heart, and it, you know, it will affect generations to come. So so when I talk about that with other Māori, particularly with other Māori women, it's sort of like it kind of creates this space of consciousness and the space of permission of just being Māori, whatever that kind of means, because there's so much disconnection. And so in that space, we kind of like we can speak our language. Many Māori can't speak language. We can't speak our own te reo Māori, but you know, having a space for that, looking at our traditional rituals, our traditional ceremonies, and things like that, to really sort of invite the intelligence, the emotional and spiritual intelligence of our ancestors into the room, as a healing sort of a healing vibe. And it's actually really beautiful, and it's really you know, but you can't do this within an hour within the prescribed 1 hour once a week sort of thing of a Western model. So, you know, we just kind of we just do that in different ways, and of course we need to meet the Western parameters to get funding. At the end of the day, that's kind of where that comes from. So yeah.
Beautifully put. My heart is so warm to hear you speak, Donny.
I could really feel your energy coming through that. And I was just thinking about what a great resistance that is. I just think about, wow, everything you're saying versus like trauma therapy.
Yes.
as such a dead project, right? Like,
yeah.
One, is it okay if I ask another question? I'm just like, there's so much bubbling. I'm thinking, Riel, about the language that you just said when you were talking about genocide, that you always take some time to problematize it as not one thing and talk about it as ongoing and attempted genocide. Can you just lay out a little bit about why you're so insistent on that critical language, why that's so important to talk about it as ongoing and attempted versus just using language like genocide?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, and I just want to acknowledge that I'm already learning in this conversation in terms of the importance of acknowledging ecocide as well, right? Like, I mean, I think of it as they're completely interconnected, but as I sit with you both, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, that's something that's very important to bring more awareness to. And but ongoing and attempted genocide, yeah, I do feel very strongly about it, because and it picks up on what you were talking about, Donny, in terms of, and you, Vicki, as well, in our previous conversations, that trauma obscures, right? Invisibilizes and obscures like what is actually going on. So to name violence, exposes the perpetration of violence. And then we get clear on what's been happening, right? And sorry. Ongoing, because I think so many people deny that the war on our people is still happening.
Yes.
And yet it's taking so many forms. Like, it's actually relentless. Like, every single day for us Onkwe Honwe, we face that warfare, and like, I mean, I could try to explain, but I mean, I feel that there's a common understanding here among us. I attempted because we're still here. Like, we're, that I find that sort of, it gives acknowledgement to, for me as Onkwe Honwe, I think, oh, look at how systematic, brutal, and relentless, multi-layered the attack has been over centuries. And it's still ongoing, and yet we're still here. Like, as Onkwe Honwe people, we're still here. And so I say attempted to honor our strength, honor our warrior spirit, honor also the very real strength of the connection to the land and the connection to our ancestors, and how they're around us and watching out for us every single moment of every single day. And there's a power to our connection to the spirit world. And that's not understood or acknowledged by Western society, nor does it need to be, but it is real. And it's saying attempted as a way of calling on the realness of the strength of our beings and the strength of our cultures and the strength of our territories and our relationship to one another and to all of our relations. And then again, yeah, like I was saying, ongoing to bring more awareness and acknowledgement to the fact that it's a war. There's a war on our people. And it happens in many forms on many levels every day over hundreds of years.
I've been so, it's language that unsettles me. I mean, when we first talked, the first time we've ever done a talk and you talked about ongoing and attempted genocide, I was like, wow, that is fierce language. That, I think, as a white settler, I want to hear that, and it implicates me. It implicates me in that, and I cannot settle myself to the fact that there was a genocidal period and now we're in this other thing. That you are refusing to let me settle with that and continuing to disrupt and inviting me to stay conscious as a white settler that I am implicated in this, and that I like that I'm responsible, that there's collective accountability and responsibility for that going on. I find it, and that idea about it being attempted reminds me of Gord Hill, Indigenous warrior Gord Hill's beautiful work, 500 years of Indigenous resistance, and just thinking about, just never letting genocide become some label of something historical that that's part of the past, and keeping it current and accountable and being implicated as settlers. So I love that language. I think it's so useful. And I was also very...
That's really great. Thank you so much. I feel really uplifted by that too. So yeah, thank you.
And I was also taken, Donny, with your language about ecocide. And I was thinking about Vandana Shiva's work on Earth democracy, which shook me to the roots when as a social justice activist, like decades ago, when she's saying, if you're not fighting for Mother Earth, you're fighting for some human rights. Like, you can't take a human being and have them, they're inextricably linked to Mother Earth. So anyway, I was also moved, as Riel was, with your language about ecocide, but also not just that language, but also how you use it, how it's obviously a real thread that's interconnected in your own analysis and work of something that you bring to moments. Maybe say more about that.
Yeah. Wow. It's just such a significant part of who we are, like in terms of Māori and land, and our that we are the land. And actually I'll show you, there's a little in one part of our creation story, the first human she was formed from the sacred ochre clay from a place called Kurawaka, and Tani Mahuta, who was he's our primordial powerful ancestor, who is like the father of all living creatures, the forests and birds and animals and things. So he carved this beautiful, perfect human being and called her Hine Ahuone, which means earth-formed maiden. So Hine Ahuone, so he kind of he shaped her out of clay, and then he held her to him and pressed his nose, pressed into her nose and breathed life into her. So we do that when we hongi. So he breathed into her, and then as she inhaled, she sneezed and said, Te hei Māori ora, which means, behold the breath of life, or alas, the breath of life. So, so she was the first human being. And so we believe that we all whakapapa back to her. So she is our very first human ancestor. But before her, we, like Tani Mahuta, like the spiritual guardian of all living things, he was our ancestor. And he emerged from Father Sky and Mother Earth. So so in our creation story, so that's kind of how we're all sort of like interlinked together. So we always think of Hine Ahuone, and that's kind of how we believe that we whakapapa back to the earth. So so in terms of some of our ceremonies, when we were born, traditionally when we were born, the placenta, or the afterbirth, was actually buried, taken and buried in our sacred sort of like beside our urupa, like our burial sites. So these sacred burial sites where our placenta would go. So when we leave this physical world, we go back to that same place and we rejoin our ancestors, but our body goes back to the same place, back to the placenta where our whenua, where our afterbirth was buried at birth. So it kind of completes this physical cycle of life here, and then we return back to the earth. So so that obviously when our land is being stolen, it interrupts all of those ceremonies and how we identify and what it kind of therefore means. The disconnection from that is incredibly sort of violent. So we need to, we depend on the earth for, for nourishment, for shelter, for food, and we need to take care of the land. We were never, we don't believe that we can ever own or possess land, but that the land owns us, and we have been given the authority to as kaitiakitanga, which is the guardianship over the land, rather than the other way around. It's not, we don't see land as real estate.
Thanks so much for that. Thanks for sharing that. So wonderful. I'm just wondering, as we're drawing to a close, if there's just any other thoughts you have just noodling around, like anything you haven't said that you'd just like to say, or any last reflection you have on this.
Donny, I just want to honor what you're saying in terms of what I have been taught about our people's relationship to the land too, is that this question of ownership is just really quite preposterous, and for me, part of the spiritual pain that I live with as Ngāpuhi is just to see how things that to us are just really criminal just get so normalized, right? Like, and that it's a success to own something. Like, people somehow think that they've worked really hard and now their lives are somehow just that it's a meaningful development in one's life to own a piece of land. And yet for us as Ngāpuhi, it's such a reversal of the natural order of things and the right relations, right? Like, so thank you for, bringing into our conversation today that sacred role of guardianship over our territories, right? And the distress, the spiritual, and what gets seen in psychotherapeutic terms as psychological distress of that, right? So how can we begin to acknowledge things like anxiety, quote unquote, and depression as being related to the fact that we are literally being severed from every bit of meaning of our lives in our own homelands, right? So just wanted to honor what you share there, Donny. Noagoa.
Oh, kia ora Riel, kia ora Riel. And yeah, and I guess there's something about I think actually it's something that you talk about, Vic, about depression being oppression. And I also throw in there disconnection. So the word depression is disconnection and oppression squished together, and then you get, depression. But yeah, I've really kind of, I guess I'm really resonating with a lot of aspects of sameness that we share in terms of our cultures and in terms of the relentless struggle for trying to uplift our people, and also the sense of well, for me anyway, the sense of kind of like loneliness or aloneness that comes with that as being sort of maybe radicalized from my from many of my colleagues, because I just refuse to put up with this shit, and kind of keep naming this colonial, white supremacy, and I don't have the patience to tiptoe around white fragility around this anymore, and so my circle is very, very small, and I thank you, Vic, for introducing the whole concept of solidarity groups and what that means and how we kind of uphold each other, spiritually and ethically and in our practice and everything that kind of means. So I'm feeling incredibly blessed to share this space with you and to hear to hear about the work that you're doing is so deep and meaningful, and it's a huge inspiration. Thank you both so much.
I guess it just is coming to me, and is when I think about, I often spend days wondering if non-Indigenous people really have any idea what has happened to us here, what has been done in their names, especially at this time of what is being called the truth and reconciliation industry, where there's now, a supposed political will to make amends, and Vicki, in one of our publications, we amplified her quotation, like, you don't reconcile genocide, you stop it, but when you're talking, Vicki, about this notion that settlers are handed down, like something horrible happened in the past, and and it's done now. For me, in terms of being a Indigenous therapist, and sitting with people for many years in these intimate places where they're revealing their hearts to me and revealing the truths of their lives and their existences, and for myself, having had to sort through so much just in terms of a basic understanding, and so having that felt sense, that experience, that understanding of just how relentless the attack has been, and on how every single level of our existence that it occurs, and not needing to be understood, but I am often struck over and over again by just how relentless and intimate the attack of ongoing attempted genocide has been. And then when we sort of, feel and live the impact of that relentless, incessant, systemic genocidal attack that translates into the structural oppression now, right? That is, starts from an interaction on a bus all the way to, transgenerationally, as you're talking about, Donny, like just how sweeping the impacts are and how profound our efforts to remain connected to ourselves as Ngāpuhi, as original peoples in our own homelands, and then the profound offense to having a non-Indigenous mental health practitioner presume to understand and to be able to assess and to diagnose and hand back to you, oh, well, you know, you just have anxiety, or yes, that's complex trauma, or, you know, this is depression, or this is OCD, or you know, all these personality disorders. I just, there's a profound pain in that for me. And to see how our people are made vulnerable to all the attacks, but then the insult and the offense of what is supposed to be help and care and treatment, you know, and support. Like, I just, it is quite crazy making to draw on some of the languages that we've used and some of the writing that we've done, and just really wanting to give some acknowledgement to that, right? Just the layers and the complexity, and yet the simplicity at the same time of the violence and the impact of the violence. So that's sort of what I'm sitting with as I can sort of open up my mind, my heart, my spirit in the safety of this exchange as well. So yeah, Niawagoa.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank you both for sharing this space and allowing me to be like a participant in this and trying to, you know, bring you together to bring forward this like emergent dialogue that I found so rich and meaningful. So just huge gratitude to both of you. It's been wonderful to be in this space with you.
Vicki, I just want to honor you because I don't think there's a lot of ground for settlers, especially, you know, who want to stay implicated. I don't, you know, there's not a clear path of what that means. And so just to honor and extend respect to you for your commitment to stay implicated in this.
Thanks so much, Riel.
Yeah, kia ora, Vic. Thank you so much. There wouldn't be many Pākehā people that would be that would occupy the same space as you. So I, you know, really mihi atu ki a koe, really thank you and acknowledge you and your ancestors for, you know, for stepping up and continuing to just step up and show up all the time. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to finally get the two of you in the same space. I'm feeling very grateful for both your words there, but I want the end to be the two of you. It's just, in my mind, you've been so connected, and yet today is the first time you've spoken together, which I'm sure people would find shocking, given how fluid the conversation was and how much your solidarity, your pre-existing solidarity has structured safety. It's not about how long you've known someone, it's about the ethical stance and these points of connection. So I'm just so glad that the two of you were able to meet in this space.
Me too, a profound honor. Niawagoa, Donny, and Kanien'kehá. I wish you the great peace.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Kia ora. Mihi atu ki a koe, Riel. Thank you. Thank you. You too. It's been a real honor to share the space.